But the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And our critics, the critics of the faith, they don't understand that we are not as foolish as we appear. I know that doesn't sound great.
Welcome to Church of the Rock from Winnipeg. Stay tuned to this week's thought-provoking message from Pastor Mark Hughes.
Well, this morning my message is entitled, Nobody's Fool. You know, I think we all recognize that idiom, that expression. It means someone who is wise and discerning and is not easily fooled. And if we're honest with ourselves, most of us think of ourselves that way, don't we? I'm nobody's fool. I mean, I'm not easily deceived. I'm not easily tricked. And most of us, if we're really, really honest, which you might not be, we're not near as smart as we think we are. That's the definition of ignorance, isn't it? You don't know what you don't know. Who was the wisest man in Scripture? Solomon. Solomon was the wisest man in Scripture. God gave him wisdom above every one of his peers and above every man that ever lived. But go read what Solomon said at the end of his life about his wisdom. Do you remember? It's in the book of Ecclesiastes. He says, I sought wisdom. Vanity of vanities, it's all vanity. That's what he said. At the end of his life, what was he really saying? He was saying the more he sought, and the more he knew, and the more he learned, the less he realized he actually knew. One of the smartest men, the most brilliant man of our time, or of our generation, was Albert Einstein, considered a genius, an IQ of 231. And this is what he said. One day he looked up at the sky, and he says, we know nothing about it at all. He says, our knowledge is as a school child. And one day we will possibly know more than we know. But the true nature of things we will never know. Never. That's what Einstein said. If Einstein, with his 231 IQ, which is about 200 more than the rest of us, right? If he thinks we can't figure it out, maybe we just can't figure it out. How many remember the football player? Some of you CFL, NFL people remember this name, Joe Theismann. How many of you remember Joe Theismann? Joe Theismann, of course, he played for the Toronto Argonauts, and then he got recruited for the NFL, went to the Washington Redskins, became the MVP in the NFL, leading the Redskins to the Super Bowl championship. He was a brilliant quarterback. And this is one day they referred to him as a football genius, and this is what Joe Theismann said. He said, I don't think anybody in football should ever be referred to as a genius. The word genius should be reserved for people like Norman Einstein. Case in point. Well, this morning, I want to talk to you about being a fool, because we know lots about wisdom. At least we should. The Bible tells us what wisdom is. It tells us how to get it. Solomon actually in the book of Proverbs, it's called the book of wisdom. The whole Proverbs is about wisdom. He says, get wisdom, and in all you're getting, get understanding. Wisdom is the principal thing. And so we know the importance of wisdom, and I am not going to downplay that part of this. But I don't want to talk about wisdom today. I want to talk about foolishness today. And I want to talk about becoming a fool for Christ. I want to talk about becoming nobody's fool. Not a fool as the world would call it, but a fool for God. You know, it wasn't that long ago that in the 18th century where everybody believed in God. In the 18th century, almost everybody believed in God because you needed God to explain everything. You needed God to explain why the sun came up in the morning and went down in the evening. You needed God to explain why those little drops of water fell from the sky and where lightning bolts came through. I mean, that was the fingers of God, right? When there was lightning, it didn't matter whether you were a Christian or a Jew or a Muslim or what you were. You needed God to somehow explain the universe. But that's all changed in the last 300 years, hasn't it? In the last 300 years, we've begun to realize, science has begun to look at these things and have been able to explain all of these things. Now we know why the sun comes up and why the sun goes down. Now we know what those little drops of water that come from the sky when it rains are. We know how they come and the precipitation and all of the condensation and all that. We understand the science behind all these things. And unfortunately, this is what has happened, is that people have looked at this and said, well, we don't really need God anymore. What do we need God for? It is the height of human arrogance to get to that point where we think we don't need God, or worse yet, that God doesn't exist. And so when I ask the question and I say, what is a fool? Let me tell you what the true And quintessential definition of a fool is, it tells us in the book of Psalms, and it tells us twice, it says the fool says in his heart, there is no God. It's the person who declares that there is no God, or the person who says they don't need God, that is the fool. And so though we are to be fools, not that kind of fool. That is the fool of this world. That's the fool of this world that has embraced the wisdom of this world and looked at everything that the Scripture talks about, and it seems like foolishness. And I understand that. A lot of these things seem like fables, don't they? I mean, when we get accused of our critics, they look at the church and they look at Christians and they say, you guys believe these ridiculous stories. You believe this story about the earth getting flooded and Noah being saved in this boat. And you believe this story about the Red Sea being divided and the children of Israel walking across on dry land. You believe these stories about people being raised from the dead. How can you believe those fables? And I look at them and I say, how can you believe your fables? What fables? Well, how about the one about man evolving from the monkey? How about that one? That one day he was in the zoo and he escaped his captors and he got out of the zoo, and the first thing he did was he bought a house in a gated community with guards at the entrance. I don't see any evolution in that. No, I mean, there's all kinds of fables that they believe that we believe, but the fool says in his heart, there is no God. And our critics, the critics of the faith, they don't understand that we are not as foolish as we appear. I know that doesn't sound great. But see, people say, well, wasn't it the Christians that believed that the world was flat? Do you know Christians never believed that? You know, in 1543, when Copernicus wrote that the world was round and that the earth actually rotated around the sun and not vice versa, when he first declared that, it was the scientific world that balked, not the religious world. In fact, you go read the history of this, he dedicated his book to the Pope of his day because the Scripture for thousands of years had always declared that the world was round. It is he, behold, who sits above the circle of the earth, Isaiah 40. See, the Bible's always known that. Christians who have studied these things always knew that the world was round. Who do you think these people were that were getting on these boats like Marco Polo and different people? These were people that understood the world was round. And they were getting to the other side because they had read in the Scripture that the world was round. And talk about irony. Now science is telling us this, that the world we know is round, but they're saying that the universe is flat. Did you know that? We always think of the universe being this thing that spreads out in every direction. That is not what science is telling us. Show the picture there of the universe. This is what they say. It's they call us the saddle universe. They're actually beginning to think that the universe is actually shaped like this. Guess what Isaiah 29 says? It says, in those days he will dissolve the hosts of heaven and he will roll it up like a scroll. The Bible has always declared these things. It's just a matter of science catching up with what the Bible has already known. We just don't know our Bible and what these things say. But once we figure these out, we'll figure this out. That God's science is true science, and the science of this world just needs to catch up. I don't know how many in this room would know the name Francis Collins, Dr. Francis Collins, Ph.D. Francis Collins was given the job of heading up the Human Genome Project. And he and his team decoded the human genome as an international consortium of scientists, and they went and they sat down the incredible task of decoding, which they successfully did ahead of schedule, all 3.1 billion base pairs of the human DNA. They mapped the entire thing ahead of schedule. If it were not for Francis Collins, we would have no CSI Miami. And every single murder in Florida would go unsolved. Am I right about that? But we have Francis Collins and his team. They decoded the human genome. It was a tremendous scientific accomplishment. But then this was the first thing Collins did. After he finished, he resigned as the head of the Human Genome Project, and he sat down and he wrote a book, and the book was entitled The Language of God, A Scientist Presents Evidence for Belief. And Francis Collins is a devout believer, one of the most eminent scientists in all of the world today, who decoded the human genome, and he sat down and he said, let me tell you what the human DNA is. It's the language of God. It points to a creator. This can't happen by accident. This is far too complex. It is far too intricate for anything to have happened like this by accident. There has to be a creator, and it was done by intelligent design. And he sits down. Can you imagine what his contemporaries, could you imagine what his peers thought when the first thing he does is he says, this is all about God, people. This is all about the hand and the fingerprints and the language of God telling us who we are and where we came from. Now, Francis Collins' story that he tells in his book is kind of fascinating because he was an atheist. He went into the sciences as a young man. He studied, of course, chemistry and biology and all of these sciences. And then he went into medicine and he emerged as a doctor. And he said what worked so well in university as theory wasn't working so well in real life. Because as a medical doctor, and he was facing life and death issues, and he would be sitting at the bedside of somebody dying, and they would look him in the eyes and they would say, "Doctor, what do you believe?" And he said, it was in those moments that I realized the sciences that I dearly loved could not answer these questions of life and death. They couldn't answer the simple questions of, if the universe had a beginning, then who started it? Who created it? What is the meaning of life? Why am I here? Why does mathematics even work, he says. We don't even know why it works. It just works. It just proves my point. There are three types of people in this world: those who can count and those who can't. So Francis Collins, as this young doctor, is looking at his life, and he's looking at these difficult questions. Why do we exist? Where do we go when we die? What do I tell these people as they're on their deathbed? Nothing I know about science can answer the questions that these people are asking. And then he went to the scripture, and he looked to the scripture, and all of a sudden he found, through the foolishness of the gospel, he found the answer to life. And Francis Collins turned himself and his life over to Christ, and he became a devout Christian. So that when he maps the human genome, 3.1 billion base pairs of information in every single cell, he sits down and says, this is the language of God. You know, in the interest of full disclosure, I want you to know this, that Francis Collins believes in evolution. I want you to know that. He is an ardent believer in it. He's what they call a theistic evolutionist, meaning this, that he believes that God used the process of evolution to create and bring into being everything that has. Now, here's the thing on this. You probably know what I think about evolution. I'm not a fan of it. I don't believe in it. I think it's a joke, but I don't think it should be a deal breaker. I don't think we should tell people that if you can't believe in the story of Adam and Eve, then you can't be a Christian. I think it's okay, because I don't think we know the whole story yet. And so if there are Christians that believe in theistic evolution, I actually don't have a problem with it whatsoever. It's not what I believe. It may not be what you believe. But I don't think we should get all hung up on this and say, no, it happened 6,000 years ago, and this is how it happened. Because I don't think we have the full story yet. But at the risk of getting you bogged down in science that, honestly, I don't really understand, let me tell you about mitochondrial DNA. Because this is one little bit of this story that I think is so fascinating that you're going to want to know. When you look at the human DNA, we now know this, that 99.5% of your DNA is in the nucleus of every cell. Every cell has 3.1 billion base pairs. Every cell in your body, 99.5% of that is in the nucleus of that cell. But in the membrane around the nucleus, which is called the mitochondrial, that has another kind of DNA, and that DNA, catch this, only comes from the mother. 100% only comes from the mother. Now, let me tell you the significance of this. You see, here's how humanity works, is that your DNA of your father and the DNA of your mother, they came together like this, and they merged, and you became this mixture of the two, right? And that's why people say you have your mother's eyes, but you have your father's chin, right? Because we have DNA of both our mother and father, and that exists in the nucleus of every cell in our body. And that we understand. And that's why when you think of the permutations of this, that's why every single human being, no matter how many billions of human beings we ever have, they will never be two alike, right? I mean, the permutations are just beyond calculation. And God in his wisdom has done that and created every single one of you as individuals, uniquely created in his design as he planned. But then also in God's wisdom, and this is what Francis Collins points out, is that he gave you this mitochondrial DNA, which only comes down from the mother. And so that means, understand this, That means that it can be traced back because there's no mixture. It goes from mother to mother to mother to mother. And the first study was the University of Berkeley, and they took 143 people from 5 different continents in the world. They were different colors and different languages and different races. And they found that they all had in their mitochondrial DNA a common ancestry, and that they all came from one single woman in East Africa, some, what they say, 200,000 years ago. And they call this woman, catch this, they call her mitochondrial Eve. Now, this is good stuff. You see, I know it's like being live at the Discovery Channel, I get it. But I don't want you to miss the importance of this. Science has now confirmed that we have all come from one woman. Do you understand the importance of this? This is not what the theory of evolution is all about. The theory of evolution is all these strands and streams and different things going off in different ways, and I came from here, and you came from here, and he came from there. Not so. Every race, every culture, all boiled down to one woman, her name in science called mitochondrial Eve, which means this: there was a mitochondrial Adam. If there was one woman, there had to be one man somewhere. All of a sudden, the story of the book of Genesis is beginning to play out in science. You say they got it wrong. It didn't happen 200,000 years ago. Well, they've already changed that a couple of times. They're already down to 100,000 years. It may be just a while before they get down to 6,000 years or 8,000 years or 10,000 years. I don't think that matters, because one day he says he will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and he will use the foolishness of the gospel to declare that he is God and only God. I just can't wait, because I feel like I'm on the right side of this argument. And I don't care how criticized I get in the meantime, because I say, I know one day that we're going to have this picture emerge, and all of a sudden it's going to look a lot like that story of Adam and Eve, and that we all came from one man and one woman, just as the Bible declares. You know, I got to tell you my favorite joke. This is my favorite Eve joke of all time. Some of you heard it before, but it's my favorite, so I'm telling it again. See, when God made Adam, he made the woman for him, you know that. And he brought him the woman, and Adam said, "What is it?" And God said, "It's a woman." And he looked at her and said, "But she's so pretty." He says, "I know, Adam. That's so you love her." And he went over, he touched her and said, "But Lord, she's so soft." He says, "I know. That's so you love her." And then he went over and smelled her and said, "But she smells so nice." He says, "I know. That's so you love her." And then she opened her mouth. And Adam said, "But she's so stupid." And God said, "That's so she'll love you." That is the most dangerous joke I know. Because I see the daggers from every woman in the place. And I'm thinking to myself, I got to get to the punchline or I'm dead. All right. So he has said that he is going to destroy the wisdom of the wise, and he has chosen the foolishness of the preaching of the gospel to save the lost. And he says it's only foolishness to those who are perishing, but those who are being saved, it is the power of God. But I want to carry on here, and I want you to jump down to verse 25, which says this: "Because the foolishness of God is wiser than men, and the weakness of God is stronger than men. For you see your calling, brethren, that not many wise, according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble are called. But God has chosen the foolish things of the world to put to shame the wise. And God has chosen the weak things of the world to put to shame the things which are mighty. And the base things of the world and the things which are despised, God has chosen. And the things which are not, to bring to nothing the things that are." This is what he says. He says he has chosen the foolish things of this world to shame the wise. He says he has taken these. I mean, think about it. When you look at the scripture, there's some weird stuff in there, man. I mean, there's some foolish things in there. And he's telling us this. He's saying he wants you to be a fool for Christ, right? That's what he's telling you. And you know what the word he uses here? You're going to love this. It's the word moros. Moros, the Greek word moros. We have an English version of it. Do you know what it's called? It's the word moron. And he says he has chosen the morons. He is to shame the wise. Yeah. Well, you know what? You're doing exactly what I'm going to say we need to do. This is what, see, when people criticize you, which they do, people will criticize you for your faith. You go on late night television, and these comedians, have you noticed how they're attacking Christianity? Go listen to Ricky Gervais, or go listen to Bill Maher, or the late George Carlin. They just had it in for us. What are you supposed to do when you and your values are criticized, and when you and your beliefs are mocked? You know what you're supposed to do? Paul says, embrace it. He says, identify with it. I love what John Wimber wrote years ago. He wrote his autobiography, and this is what it was called. He says, I am a fool for Christ. Whose fool are you? And you know what? When we are a fool for the world, then we're a big moron. And when we're a fool for Christ, we're a little moron. That's the way I look at it. We're both morons. How many remember the moron jokes from when you were growing up, right? A big moron and a little moron are walking across a bridge. The big moron falls into the water. How come the little moron didn't fall off the bridge? Because he was a little more on. That's right. And here's what I think. We're all fools, but I'm a little moron. So I'd rather be a little moron for Christ than a big moron for the world. How many of you know what I'm talking about? Remember that whole foolishness of preaching thing and how I was qualified for it? It's working for me. So when we look at this, we understand that we are to be fools for Christ, that we are to embrace the gospel even when it doesn't make sense. We are to embrace the fact that we will sometimes be criticized for our faith, and they will say it's foolishness, but only to those who are perishing. And to us who know God, it is the power of God. And this is how I want to wind up this message this morning. I want to give you three things that Paul says about the foolishness of God and the wisdom of man. This is what he says. He says he has chosen the foolish things to shame the wise. He has chosen the weak things to shame the mighty, and he has chosen the debased or the despised things to shame the noble. I want to talk about that just for a few moments, because nobody wants to be a fool, but I want you to be nobody's fool but Christ. I want you to be a fool for Christ, to understand that he has called you to a greater purpose, and you're not going to understand all of the world and all of history and all. Neither did Einstein, neither did Solomon. But instead, we embrace the fact that God will take the foolish things of this world and he will use them to confound and to shame the wise. I mean, as you look through Scripture, what do you see? You see one ridiculous story after another. Am I right? You just see one crazy story. You look and you read these stories, you go, really? God, this is your plan? Do you remember when the children of Israel came across the Jordan River and they went up against Jericho? Jericho was the most fortified city of its day. And so Joshua lines the people up and says, now here's our plan. Here's how we're going to take this fortified city with walls so big there's houses built on top of them. Here's how we're going to do it. We're going to march around the city in silence 7 times, or once a day for 7 days. And on the 7th day, we're really going to get them. We're going to go around it 7 times. Now you say, why did he have them march around in silence? I'll tell you why. Because it was such a stupid idea that if he had let them talk, they would have complained the whole time, right? You imagine these guys marching around these huge walls that you can't see to the top? Hey, Izzy, is this the dumbest idea you've ever seen or what? I mean, these guys would be going around these walls whining and complaining. He says, no, this is how we're going to do it. This is how it's going to play out. We're going to march around these walls, and you're not going to say a word. And so for 7 days, they marched around. 7 days. On the 7th day, this was the straw that broke the camel's back, right? They marched around it 7 times. And then after they finished marching around it the 7th time, what did they do? They blew the trumpets. They blew the trumpets, and the walls came tumbling down, and they rushed in and took the city. How exactly did that work? What was the wisdom behind that? Wow, you know what? They've excavated the city of Jericho, and it is exactly what they say. those walls came tumbling down. In fact, some of those walls went straight down into the ground. And they have discovered that it sits on top of an earthquake fault. So there's a natural explanation for it. Sure, there's a natural explanation for it, that at the exact moment that they blew those trumpets, those walls came tumbling down. You say, what happened? Well, there was this, harmonic dissonance that happened with the trumpets and the march. I don't know. There was an earthquake and the walls came tumbling down. You say, well, it was a natural occurrence. Well, that's just a greater miracle for me, that God timed it in the moment. I mean, here it was. They didn't know what was going to happen, and turns out God used cool jazz to do it. Just a little trumpets, that's all needed. And you look into Scripture, you see one ridiculous story like that after another, because God has chosen the foolish things to shame the wise. So God has chosen the foolish things to shame the wise. He has chosen the weak things to shame the mighty. Now, when you think of the story of David and Goliath, which I love to talk about, but when you think of that story, out of all the people he could have chosen to defeat Goliath, why did he choose David? Why David? I'll tell you why, because he was the weakest of them all. He wasn't even a soldier. He wasn't even old enough to be a soldier. He was the least. If you go read the story, he was the least of all his brothers. Am I right about that? He was this tiny little guy, and he only happened to be showing up. Why didn't he choose Saul? Saul would have been the likely candidate. He was head and shoulders above every man. Why? Because God has chosen the weak things of this world to shame the mighty. And out of all the people that could have defeated Goliath, it was David, this scrawny little shepherd boy. Why? Because that's the wisdom of God. God chooses the weak things to shame the wise. You see that pattern again and again and again and again all the way through Scripture. So the first thing, he will use the foolish things to shame the wise. He will use the weak things to shame the mighty. And the last thing, he said he will use the despised things to shame the noble. You go through Scripture and you will be amazed at how often God takes the most shamed and unworthy and disgraced people and uses them for his great glory and his great purpose. You go look at the genealogy of Jesus as just one example. There are 4 women in his line. They are an interesting bunch of women. The first one is Tamar. Tamar was the one who played the harlot. The next one was Bathsheba. Bathsheba, of course, was the adulterer, the adulteress that had the affair with David. The next one is Ruth, and Ruth was a Gentile. She wasn't even Jewish. And the other one was Rahab. Rahab was not only a Gentile, she was a prostitute. And these people are in the line in the genealogy of Jesus. You say, how can that be? Because he has chosen the despised things to shame the noble. Not many wise, not many noble, not many great will be saved, because he has looked down at the world and he says, when you were at your lowest, when you're at the place where you think you're of no value anymore, that's the time when I want to use you. Think about Lech Walesa. Lech Walesa of Poland. In the 1970s, he was an electrician working for the union. He became the head of the union. He got fired from his job. He got imprisoned. He got persecuted. He was under surveillance by the KGB, and he persisted. He was the most wanted and hated man by the government of Poland for years and years and years. In 1983, while they're still under the constraints of the Russian Empire, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize. And then in 1989, the Iron Curtain fell, and in 1990, they hold the first general election in Poland that they've had in 50 years, and who emerges as the president of Poland? But Lech Walesa. You see, that's how this thing works. God chooses the despised things to shame the noble. And if you feel unworthy, if you feel foolish, if you feel weak, if you feel despised, if you feel you have nothing to offer, then you're in the best place that you could ever be, because you're in the place where God is going to raise you up all through history, all through the Scripture. He has taken people like you and like me, and we're at our lowest place. That is where he has raised us up. That's where he wants us. He says if you go take the high seat, he's going to give you the low seat. But if you take the low seat, he's going to raise you up, and he's going to exalt you. Because greater is he who is in you than he that is in the world. And if God be for you, who can be against? Let's stand together.
Church of the Rock has services every Sunday at 1397 Buffalo Place, and we invite you to join us when you're in the Winnipeg area. If you'd like a booklet to help you understand more about God's gift of forgiveness and reconciliation through Jesus Christ, please contact us, and we'd be happy to send you a free copy of the Book of Hope. Visit our website at www.churchoftherock.ca.